house must be moved quickly or it's going to fall into the sea. And like hundreds of North Carolina beach cottages, past, present, future, the eroding shoreline has simply caught up with it. For some, this is a tragic and an ugly sight, but I think it's beautiful because surrendering this house to the sea represents a bright promise for our future. I'm a geologist by training, and barrier islands are my laboratory. But even if this wasn't my job, I know that I'd spend every spare moment that I could on barrier islands. Because besides being scientifically fascinating, these islands have a unique spiritual quality about them that comes from their wild natural beauty and their sense of history and cultural heritage that is so much a part of the North Carolina coast. I'm Orrin Pilkey, and I spent 25 years exploring and trying to understand these barrier islands. And I'd like to share with you now some of the things that I've learned. The most important fact I've learned, and in fact the key to understanding these barrier islands, is that the only constant here is change. Sand dunes rise and fall, beaches shrink and grow, and whole barrier islands can move landward. Just like a living creature, a barrier island never stands still. And just like living creatures, the movement here is not random. It's all part of a pattern of stimulus and response. In fact, I've really come to think of these barrier islands as living things. They're constantly responding in sensible and even intelligent ways to the forces of wind and water. So movement and change are keys to understanding barrier islands, and nowhere is rapid change more obvious than here on the beach. The beach is a very special place. It's even a magical place. It's the most dynamic strip of land on Earth, and to be on a beach is to be in a sea of constant change. Sand is always on the move, blown by the wind, carried by the waves. The importance of change is so great here that the beach is actually defined by the movement of sand.
When we think of the beach, we tend to think of that narrow strip of dry sand that runs between the sand dunes and the sea. But the above-water beach, called the recreational beach, is like the tip of an iceberg peeking above the water. The whole beach is actually a wide, mobile band of sand stretching from the first line of dunes to an ocean depth of about 30 feet. In North Carolina, that may be a mile or more out to sea. Outside that break point, sand falls to the ocean floor and is lost to the beach system. But within the beach system, on the underwater shore face, sand is constantly on the move. Locked in a pulsating back and forth motion, sand seems to be going nowhere, but for all its vacillation, net sand movement is either onshore or offshore, depending on the weather conditions. In fair weather, the net movement of sand is onshore. Nudged by gentle wave action, sand works its way up the shore face. Often the moving sand accumulates on one or more underwater sandbars. Over a period of weeks, these bars march up the shore face and weld onto the beach berm, adding their volume of sand to the recreational beach.
The next time you're at the beach, note the sandbars as you wade into the surf zone. Watch them carefully for a few days, and you may see that these bars are slowly marching ashore. This gradual movement of sandbars is the process by which fair weather waves build up the beach. But during storms, high waves crash ashore, the behavior is quite different, and things happen much more rapidly.
When large storm waves pound the shore, sand movement is more rapid, and net sand movement is offshore. In a big storm, sand is torn away from the above-water beach and distributed offshore, flattening the entire shore face. As the slope of the beach becomes more gentle, the energy of incoming waves dissipates over a broader surface area, and the impact of waves on the upper beach becomes less and less. In addition to flattening the beach, sand removed from the dunes may accumulate in offshore storm bars. These large sandbars in effect trip the powerful storm waves, causing them to break harmlessly offshore. When a violent storm is rearranging the beach, it is easy to see the process as destructive. And when the storm has blown over, our fears seem justified. Vertical sand cliffs or beach scarps are a sure sign of massive erosion, and the wide, flat beach shows no evidence of an elevated berm. But this beach storm response is in fact a mechanism for survival. It is a way for the beach to bend without breaking, to absorb the swift fury of a hurricane or the extended punishment of a northeaster. With the return of gentle fair weather waves, sand will begin to move ashore once again. The shore face will steepen, and the recreational beach will build up. This process will take time, a matter of years after a big storm, but beach recovery will take place until the next storm interrupts it. And still the cycle will continue, the enduring tug-of-war between fair weather and storm, the balance of nature that at any given moment determines the shape of the beach.
So sand at the beach moves onshore and offshore, and gentle fair weather waves build up the beaches while the storm waves flatten the beaches. Here we're standing on a flat beach because a storm has just passed by. But if you come back here next summer, it'll have quite a different appearance. It'll be both steeper and somewhat narrower. But on and offshore transportation is only part of the picture. There's also longshore transportation, movement of sand up and down the beach. You've experienced the longshore current if you've ever been swept away from your towel while you're swimming at the beach. And if that current can carry you, imagine what it can do with a few grains of sand.
Ocean waves rarely come ashore head-on. Instead, they strike at an angle to the waterline, forming a current that runs in the surf zone parallel to the shore. This is the longshore current, flowing like a river along the shoreline. In the short term, sand flows either up coast or down coast, depending largely on weather conditions and the orientation of wind and waves. But over most of the North Carolina coast, with a few localized exceptions, the net flow of sand is from north to south.
Just standing here on the beach, you can see a lot of sand in the water column of the surf zone because of the brown discoloration. But this gives you no idea of the amount of sand that's being transported by here. On this North Carolina beach, perhaps 100,000 cubic yards of sand per year are transported in that direction. Along some California beaches, 1 million cubic yards of sand may be transported in a single year. Think of it this way. If I contracted with someone to carry 1 million cubic yards of sand by here, it would require 260 dump trucks per day, or 1 truck each 6 minutes, day and night, for a whole year.
We may not normally be conscious of the volume of sand moving past us in the surf zone, but it plays a vital role in shaping the barrier islands. And nowhere is this more true than where tidal inlets penetrate the island chain.
When we think of inlets, we tend to think of water, because inlets are the channel through which the tides push the water in and out of the sounds. But the real importance of inlets is in the storage and transportation of sand. For example, the amount of sand stored at a single inlet may be greater than the total volume of sand on the adjacent islands. And it's not uncommon for 200,000 cubic yards to be transferred from one side of the inlet to the other side, or from one island to the next island, during a single storm. Although inlets only make up 2% of the North Carolina shoreline, understanding the processes here is critical to understanding the processes on North Carolina's barrier islands.
A barrier inlet represents a continuing battle for survival, a battle waged between the tides that try to keep an inlet open and the longshore current that tries to choke it with sand. Tidal flow keeps a channel scoured in the inlet, but it also interrupts the longshore current, capturing the current's considerable cargo of sand and storing it in two fan-shaped deltas, a flood tidal delta in the Sound and an ebb tidal delta in the ocean. In this amazingly dynamic system, lobes of sand and the tidal channels through them are constantly shifting. And superimposed on this channel wagging may be even more dramatic movement. In North Carolina, whole inlets move in three distinct patterns. Breathing inlets, like Bogue Inlet, remain in place but expand and contract in a cycle that spans decades. Migrating inlets, like Oregon Inlet, form in one place and migrate with the longshore current. Returning inlets, like New Topsail Inlet, migrate too, but may return or jump back to near their original location to continue the cycle of migration and return.
Not only do inlets expand and contract and migrate, but they also come and go. So an inlet that's on the chart today may not have been on the charts in the past and may not be on the charts in the future. For example, we have 4 inlets between Cape Lookout and the Virginia line. These are Oregon Inlet, Hatteras Inlet, Ocracoke Inlet, and Drum Inlet. But over the years, 26 inlets have existed along this shoreline stretch long enough to be named and put on charts, and all but 4 of them are gone.
The closing or migration of a waterway between two islands means obvious change for those islands, but the true importance of inlets is that their natural behavior can release volumes of sand that profoundly affect the very shape of the islands. The relocation of an inlet channel in a big storm can transfer thousands of cubic yards of sand from the ebb tidal delta to the downstream island. And the closing or migration of an inlet leaves a massive flood tidal delta that will eventually become incorporated into the backside of the island. It is not because of the flow of water, but rather because of the storage and distribution of sand that it is impossible to overemphasize the active role of inlets in shaping the barrier islands.
Inlets open, migrate, close, sandbars march up the beach, beaches flatten during a storm. All these processes play a role in the evolution of our barrier islands. But what were the processes that formed our barrier islands to begin with? Let's back up a little, say 15,000 years, to the time when I could walk 40 miles in that direction, when glaciers were beginning to melt and when the sea level was beginning to rise.
About 15,000 years ago, sea level was 300 feet lower than it is today. Where ocean waves now roll was a vast forested coastal plain extending 40 miles east of today's shoreline to the edge of the continental shelf. At that time, increasing global temperatures began releasing a huge volume of water from the glacial ice caps. Rising sea level flooded the valleys of the coastal plain, and century on century of the erosive action of wind and water on the resulting headlands left a chain of above-water sandbars stretching along the coast. Some of our existing islands, like Coeur Bank and Masonboro Island, retain the characteristics of these early barrier islands. Low, thin islands sparsely vegetated with zones of grass and maritime forests and backed by salt marsh. But still, sea level continued to rise. Faced with submersion and destruction, the islands began a process that would ensure their survival. As storms attacked, large waves overwashed the narrow island, depositing sand in overwashed fans that extended the back of the island toward the mainland, even as the front side was being scoured away. Receding on the front and accreting on the back, the islands rolled over themselves like the tread on a bulldozer. Responding to potential destruction in this seemingly intelligent and sensible way, the barrier islands preserved themselves by migrating up the continental shelf, always maintaining their elevation above the rising sea level. On some sections of the coast, the islands migrated faster than the mainland shoreline retreated, letting the islands literally crash into the continent. Today, there are no barrier islands around Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Farther north, the gentle slope of the coastal plain caused the mainland shoreline to retreat faster than the islands could migrate, leaving an unusually wide, shallow body of water, the Albemarle and Pamlico Sounds, separating mainland North Carolina from the Outer Banks.
Barrier island migration is not just a venturesome academic theory. It is accepted fact, and the evidence is all over the beach. Take these oyster shells, for example. Oysters live in the salt marsh on the sound side of the island. So how do we get so many oyster shells on the open ocean side of the island here on the beach?
As the island rolls over itself in its migration, the beach moves back over the old marsh. Fossil oyster shells from the marsh, thousands of years old, erode out on the shore face and are washed up on today's beach. The shells of sound-dwelling oysters are found on the beach because today's beach is where the sound used to be. In effect, the beach came to the oysters. The same is true of the salt marsh and its floor of thick black mud. Often mistaken by beachgoers for an oil spill, salt marsh mud found on the oceanside beach is more clear proof of barrier island migration.
The evidence is very clear, but we haven't always understood it. Until 20 years ago, the process of shoreline erosion was considered to be a process of island destruction. But now we understand that the process of shoreline erosion is actually better termed shoreline retreat, and it's all part of the island migration process. During the last sea level rise, these islands survived by migrating 40 miles across the continental shelf to this location. And it is only because of a 4,000-year pause in the island migration process at the present location that we have these high dunes, these wide islands, and these beautiful maritime forests.
About 5,000 years ago, sea level rise slowed dramatically, and the barrier islands paused in roughly their present location. Overwash now penetrated only the first line of dunes, depositing its cargo of sand on the island and building up the island's elevation. Windborne sand, brought to ground by the tiniest obstruction, collected in dunes where grasses volunteered, accelerating the building process and anchoring the dunes in place. Sheltered from the harsh salt spray by larger dunes, maritime forests of cedar and live oak thrived, often blanketing much of the island from sound to open ocean. Monster sand dunes, known as medanos, unanchored by vegetation, rolled inexorably across the face of the islands, burying everything in their path, including mature maritime forest. As a medano rolled slowly on, the skeletons of the forest might emerge once again to haunt the island as a ghost forest. But elsewhere, the islands were bursting with life, and with a life of their own. For thousands of years, Sikatan, Croatoan, and Roanoke passed the summers on these barrier islands, hunting the dense maritime forests and harvesting fish and oysters from the sounds. But when the chilly winds of autumn blew in off the ocean, seasonal camps were abandoned for the safety of permanent town sites on the mainland. The Indians recognized that the barrier island environment, exposed to winter storms and prone to flooding, was not suitable for year-round habitation. The first Europeans followed the lead of native tribes, instinctively bypassing the outer banks for the relative protection of Roanoke Island, and eventually establishing their first permanent settlements on the mainland at Bath, Edenton, and Beaufort. It was not until the early 1700s that isolated colonists ventured to live on the islands year-round. But by the middle of the century, real island towns began to appear.
Year-round settlements were established on Ocracoke Island, Shackelford Island, and here on Portsmouth Island. These were not just a cluster of beach cottages. These are genuine working communities of 500 or more people. We can learn a lot from the way the early settlers approached life on a barrier island. These were people who made a hard living on the water, and the way they built their communities reflected a profound respect for the forces of the sea that surrounded them. In these barrier island communities well knew that not every day on a barrier island is a calm summer day. Storms here were just one more hard fact of life, and confronting a storm was simply not an option. These people knew that to survive here, it was not enough to live on the island, you had to live with the island.
Towns were invariably located on the protected backside of an island, as here at Portsmouth. Intelligent site selection was natural and instinctive for people who lived so close to nature. Challenging the forces of wind and water by building on the ocean side of the island would have been unthinkable. Building sites were selected to take advantage of what little shelter the island had to offer. Wherever possible, houses were nestled in the hummocks on the backside of the island, where the forest offered protection from wind and flood. Sometimes a trapdoor was cut in the floor of an islander's house, since purposely allowing rising floodwaters to enter freely could save the house by preventing the entire structure from floating off its foundation. And this common-sense approach to living with an island applied not only to the sober working communities, but to those where fun was the order of the day. At Nag's Head, an established resort long before the Civil War, locals and visitors alike lodged on the backside of the island, making day outings to the oceanside beach for strolling or saltwater bathing. In the years immediately following the Civil War, the first adventurous vacationers began to build cottages on the beach. Built from used construction lumber and wood salvaged from shipwrecks, these primitive ramshackle summer cottages were dubbed the unpainted aristocracy. Evidence of a willingness to remain flexible in the face of nature, the unpainted aristocracy were never considered permanent. If demolished by a storm, a cottage was reassembled from whatever materials were available. If threatened by waves, the structure was simply placed on log rollers and dragged back from danger. The Outlaw Cottage at Nag's Head has been moved 5 times since it was built in 1885. Sometimes the sequence of moves left a trail of chimney foundations, one in the house, one on the beach, and one in the surf zone.
Sometimes being flexible was as simple as cutting a trapdoor or dragging a cottage back from the waves. But sometimes being flexible called for dramatic measures. It called for recognition of the fact that there comes a point when you can't live with an island. That recognition could come from an individual, or it could come from an entire community.
The center of a thriving North Carolina whaling industry was Diamond City on Shackelford Island, the town taking its name from the geometric pattern painted on the nearby Cape Lookout lighthouse. Diamond City numbered as many as 500 inhabitants in its day, but today there is little evidence that it ever existed. A series of storms in the 1890s flooded the island repeatedly, ruining gardens, damaging buildings, and floating bones out of the graveyards. When a full hurricane struck the island in 1899, the residents of Diamond City called it quits. People loaded their houses onto rafts and moved to safety. By 1902, there was little evidence of Diamond City's existence on Shackelford Island. But on Harker's Island, and here in the Promised Land section of Morehead City, some modest houses from Shackelford Island still stand as a tribute to the adaptability of the people of Diamond City.
Clearly, the early settlers left their mark on these islands. They stripped the islands of timber to make sailing ships, and their livestock overgrazed the vegetation that stabilized the island. But the changes made by the early settlers were only superficial. It would be years before less intelligent site selection and an attitude of inflexibility toward nature would threaten the very existence of these islands. After the Second World War, heavy machinery replaced the mule and drag pan as the tools for moving sand. And now that it was possible to move sand in huge volumes, move it we did in a frantic effort to keep up with the exploding demand for vacation homes. But too often, in our rush to cash in on the boom, we seemed intent not only on selecting inappropriate building sites, but in actively making those sites more dangerous than they naturally were. Rolling, healthy dune fields were bulldozed, and the sand sometimes actually hauled away to provide level lots and a better view of the ocean for tract housing. In the process, we crippled the beach's protective storm response, and we drastically increased the potential for storm damage to the buildings. Acre after acre of forest was cleared to make way for development. Here, 50 acres of mature maritime forest were destroyed, forests that might have sheltered the structures from storm, wind, and waves, to make room for one small hotel. Finger canals were cut through the islands to accommodate the vacation homeowner's dream of a boat tied up outside the back door. The result was too often the creation of a stagnant, algae-infested backwater that not only polluted the island's fresh water supply, but it provided a convenient weak spot on the island for the formation of a new inlet. On the backside of the island, new real estate for construction was created by burying useless salt marsh, filling it in with sand and soil. But the real price for this cheap land was the loss of a protective buffer against sound-side erosion and an important nursery for marine organisms, including many deep-water commercial fish. Inherently poor septic action in the buried marsh also polluted nearby shellfish breeding grounds. Some of the destructive development practices of the post-war boom are now illegal or out of favor. The dune line that was once deliberately removed is now incurred by beachfront property owners. And marshland, valued again for its erosion protection and for its role in the life cycle of many marine species, is no longer being buried. This marsh at Pine Knoll Shores was actually planted and nurtured. But as demand for Barrier Island property continues to escalate, one legacy of the post-war boom continues apace: the choice of less and less intelligent sites for construction. These development plans, mercifully never realized, sited a new community in the shadow of the Cape Lookout Lighthouse, almost exactly where the houses of storm-ravaged Diamond City once stood. A telltale dip in the highway clearly marks this section of Bogue Banks as the location of a former inlet and as a likely location for a new inlet, a fact confirmed by the presence of an old flood tidal delta. Yet these homes were built squarely in the path of the inlet channel as though to tempt nature. And still the trend continues.
This house in calm weather may have the best view of the sea in all of North Carolina, but in a storm, the owners may find they have too good a view of the sea. I think this house at the north end of Topsail Island is the most dangerous house in North Carolina.
Built so close to the inlet that it was underwater several times while it was being constructed, this house will almost certainly be destroyed by the first big storm. But this house is dangerous mostly to its owners. Up and down the island chain, there is development in progress that threatens not only a handful of residents, but much of what we cherish about our life on our coast. High-density development, the construction of massive, immovable structures on a low, narrow, shifting strip of sand, is a recipe for disaster. Storm evacuation routes easily flood and choke with sand, raising the potential for loss of life. Sewer and toxic runoff from the pavement pollute shellfish breeding grounds in the sounds and the estuaries. And the enormous footprint of the building and surrounding pavement traps huge amounts of sand that must remain free to move if the island is to remain healthy. For many people, this development, the Villa Capriani at North Topsail Shores, has become a symbol of the wrong approach to living with an island. The Villa Capriani exemplifies all the specific evacuation and pollution problems of high-density island development. But most serious of all, Villa Capriani type development represents the ultimate loss of flexibility in living with a barrier island.
The worst part of this development is that it will soon be threatened with shoreline erosion, and this will generate political pressure to build a seawall. Your first intuition, of course, is why not protect the building? Are we going to let it fall into the sea? But we know from the experience of neighboring states that protecting buildings with a seawall extracts a very severe environmental price.
South Carolina has already taken the first steps down the road of shoreline engineering. At North Myrtle Beach, along the wide beaches of the Grand Strand, they have succeeded in protecting a handful of buildings. But the engineering is ugly, revealing generations of attempts to hold back the sea. Access to the beach is awkward, even at the best of times. And twice a day at high tide, there is no beach.
But we have to come here to New Jersey to see the end point of shoreline engineering. It's not a very pretty end point, and it's certainly not what I want to see along the North Carolina shoreline. We call this hard stabilization. First, let's look at what hard stabilization is. It's defined as holding the shoreline in place with immovable hard objects. And hard stabilization can take many forms.
A groin is a structure built perpendicular to the shoreline, projecting from the shore into the water. Groins trap sand carried by the longshore current, building up the beach on the upstream side of the structure. But sand supply below the groin is greatly reduced, causing downstream erosion. As a groin traps sand upstream, allowing only a small quantity to trickle around the tip, the only salvation for a downstream property owner may be to capture that trickle with his own groin. And that is why a groin rarely stands alone, but tends to multiply into a groin field. Like a groin, a jetty is a structure perpendicular to the shoreline, but a jetty is specifically designed to stabilize an inlet by blocking the longshore current. In addition to trapping sand on the upstream side, long jetties actually channel sand so far offshore that it is lost to the beach system. Downstream erosion caused by a jetty may be so dramatic that it manifests itself as full-scale barrier island migration. The construction of the Masonboro jetties at Wrightsville Beach is causing Masonboro Island to migrate at a rate of 17 feet per year. The erosion rate on Assateague Island, Virginia, exploded from 2 feet a year to 36 feet a year when a jetty was built at its northern end. Assateague Island once lined up with Ocean City, but since 1935, it has migrated a full island's width, a direct result of its sand supply being cut off by the jetty. The experience of Masonboro and Assateague Island should be a lesson to those who dismiss barrier island migration as a process taking thousands of years.
Groins and jetties certainly have their bad points. They cause erosion in a downstream direction, and they cause loss of sand in an offshore direction. But at least they're somewhat subtle in that they work with a natural sand transportation system. And their design, or at least their successful design, requires an understanding of that system. But seawalls are brute force technology.
A seawall is a structure built parallel to the shoreline. Whether it is a small wooden bulkhead, a rock or metal wall, or a rock revetment, its function is to protect buildings by repelling the sea. In this, seawalls can be successful. Unfortunately, there is a predictable and depressing pattern to the implementation of seawalls on beaches. A small protective wall may seem beneficial at first, but as the retreating beach catches up with the wall, the slope of the beach deepens in front of the wall. Unable to use naturally protective storm response, the beach cannot dissipate the fury of the attacking waves. Eventually, the wall will fail to be replaced with a larger wall. As the beach on either side of the wall naturally recedes, the wall must be extended along the beach, or it must be bent back to guard against an end-around effect. It is an inevitable pattern of larger and longer walls at greater and greater expense. But the real price of saving the buildings is paid with a currency other than the dollar. Debris from the succession of walls will litter the beach. And when the recreational beach inevitably disappears from in front of the wall, the debris will lurk as underwater hazards for the swimmer. In the long term, the true price of saving buildings with a seawall includes a complete loss of the recreational beach.
When hard stabilization goes this far, I call this process New Jerseyization. And here at Seabright, New Jersey, we have the end point of New Jerseyization. In my opinion, this is the worst beach in North America. The seawall is so high that you can't see the sea from the second-story windows behind it. And nothing is left of the beaches except for the sea breeze which used to blow across them. It is here in Seabright, New Jersey, that the truths of hard stabilization really hit home. The point here is not to pick on the state of New Jersey. At one point, their beaches were just as beautiful as our beaches, and now they have to use a tide table in order to know when to go swimming. But we in North Carolina should not be smug about the pristine nature of our beaches. When New Jersey began hard stabilization, nobody knew where it would lead. But now, we know where hard stabilization leads. And still, there's a danger in North Carolina that we're allowing the New Jerseyization of our shoreline. The bottom line for North Carolina is hard stabilization destroys beaches. North Carolina has avoided going down the path of hard stabilization, the path of New Jerseyization that leads to Seabright. In 1984, the North Carolina Coastal Resources Commission banned hard stabilization, requiring alternate solutions to the problem of shoreline erosion. One alternative is beach replenishment. In beach replenishment, the recreational beach is built up artificially by bringing in sand, either by dump truck from the mainland or more often by pipeline from a dredge in the inlet, in the sound, or offshore. Beach replenishment has been used extensively on some parts of the North Carolina shoreline. Wrightsville Beach and Carolina Beach have been replenished more times than any other beaches on the East Coast. Beach replenishment can be successful in stabilizing an erosional recreational beach. The wooden bulkhead once protected this Carolina beach cottage from the waves. Now, after replenishment, there was a wide buffer of protective dune and recreational beach. But beach replenishment as a policy has its own problem, both philosophical and physical. Philosophically, it raises the question of exactly what is being saved. The beach that belongs to everyone, although we know that a natural beach needs no protection, or the buildings of a few. Physically, the inherent problem with beach replenishment is in the volume of sand introduced. Although a newly replenished beach looks well built up, the project in reality perches a relatively insignificant amount of sand on top of the huge volume of mobile sand that makes up the entire beach. The first major storm will simply redistribute the pumped sand onto the underwater shore face. That is why replenished beaches have a relatively short life expectancy. Despite the claims of the Army Corps of Engineers, the organization that sells beach replenishment projects to seashore communities, the evidence is quite clear that we can only expect a multi-million-dollar replenished beach in North Carolina to last 2 to 4 years. But this may all be a moot point. There are changes coming to our barrier islands that will make isolated beach replenishment by individual communities ineffective and inadequate. The future of the North Carolina shoreline will demand a much broader and more comprehensive approach to coastal management.
You remember Joe, the comic strip character in Little Abner, the one with the perpetual cloud hanging over his head? Well, a lot of people think that I'm like Joe, with a black cloud over my head, and they think that I'm a prophet of doom. But when I look around, I see that we have a lot to be pleased about the North Carolina beaches, a lot to be proud of. For example, we have great recreational beaches, and we have relatively light development along our beaches so far. And 50% of our beaches are in national parks or in state parks. And on developed shorelines, we have relatively good access for the public. Furthermore, the public here in North Carolina understands how beaches work, and they care about beaches for the future generations. But the really good news for future generations is that we have few seawalls. North Carolina has led the way in promoting regulations that prevent the armoring of our shoreline and hence the destruction of our beaches. And we can take a lot of pride in that. But there is bad news. These regulations that guarantee that my grandchildren will have beaches are not fixed in stone, and in fact, the pressure to overturn them will only increase. Our continuing boom in beach development is on a collision course with our receding shoreline. Present-day erosion rates are catching up with structures built imprudently close to the sea. But the problems we see today pale in comparison to those that we are destined to see in the not-so-distant future. 4 out of North Carolina's 5 fastest-growing counties are on the coast, and the booming growth in these counties is near the water. And as our shoreline population explodes, rising global temperatures resulting from the greenhouse effect promise a new era of rising sea level. By the year 2100, sea level will rise between 1 1/2 feet and 7 feet above its present level. Even a 2-foot rise in sea level will mean dramatic changes in the North Carolina shoreline, since each foot of sea level rise on the gentle slope of our coastal plain can translate into as much as 2,000 feet of shoreline retreat. So there is a dark cloud gathering over our island. The sea level rise is a reality, and we can't ignore it, and it's not in the distant future. The acceleration of the sea level rise will begin in 20 years or so, when the buildings we erect now will still be standing. The islands are already thinning in preparation for migration. Decisions that we make today will affect our shoreline for generations to come. How will North Carolina deal with the impending crisis? At the present time, our most widely used weapon is beach replenishment. But beach replenishment by itself is only a Band-Aid. It is not a cure. It is not a long-term solution. Another option is hard stabilization, but it is clear from the New Jersey experience where that road leads. Here is a probable scenario for an existing development on the North Carolina shoreline if hard stabilization is permitted. The Villa Capriani on North Topsail Island is an immovable object being built naively close to an irresistible force. Within 10 years from today, a bulkhead will be needed to protect the Soundside Road. On the ocean side, several costly replenishment projects will fail and a seawall will be installed. Within a decade of seawall construction, the recreational beach will disappear, leaving a beach resort without a beach. Eventually, the cost of protection will exceed the value of the property. The Villa Capriani will be abandoned and go to sea as a very expensive fishing reef. This scenario is not fantasy. It is happening today to buildings up and down the East Coast. The random protection of individual buildings is obviously not an acceptable solution to the problem of sea level rise. There is a response to sea level rise and to barrier island migration that will preserve the barrier islands and allow future generations to enjoy them. We call this response relocation. And by that we mean let nature take her course while we adapt to the changing conditions. We step back when necessary. We move or remove the buildings as the shoreline catches up with them. And just like a lumberjack doing a slow roll on a log, we keep our balance as the island rolls beneath us. This isn't a new idea. This is the way man has traditionally lived on barrier islands. Like dragging a cottage back from the sea. Like a whole town moving to a more suitable site. We relocate as the islands move. Used selectively, beach replenishment would continue to be an important tool in fine-tuning the timing of our relocation. Relocation as a coastal management policy allows us to retain flexibility in dealing with sea level rise. It allows us to preserve our beaches and the lifestyle and heritage that we associate with those beaches.
and it is the cheapest option, far cheaper than massive hard stabilization. Can North Carolina make a policy of relocation work? In fact, we are making it work. With each storm at Nags Head, several cottages are either moved or claimed by the sea. And after Hurricane Hugo, more than 70 houses on Ocean Isle alone were either destroyed or moved back from the shoreline. We are fortunate that North Carolina is in a good position to make relocation a policy. First, we have low-density development. Second, the federal flood insurance program now offers financial help to remove or relocate endangered houses. Third, and possibly most important, we have few seawalls to limit our flexibility. The key to the future of North Carolina's beaches are our anti-seawall regulations. These regulations will prevent this from happening to our beaches. But we must stand firm on the first test of these regulations. For example, private individuals have proposed hard stabilization at the Riggings condominiums, the Summer Winds condominiums, and the Corps of Engineers has proposed to build groins and jetties at Oregon Inlet. The Corps of Engineers has proposed to build a long groin on Topsail Island. The Corps of Engineers has proposed to build a seawall at Fort Fisher. The Corps of Engineers has proposed to build a seawall around the base of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. We must control the Corps of Engineers if our anti-seawall regulations are to survive. The Corps of Engineers has a very proud history in many ways, but when it comes to the engineering of beach sand, it does not have a proud history. In a state such as ours, where we're trying to limit the amount of shoreline engineering, the Corps can become a loose cannon. The most fundamental problem is that on the district level, the Corps of Engineers requires funding of individual projects for their very survival. And such pressure to fund can result in absurd cost-benefit ratios and quite poor science. Now the Corps is taking active steps to undermine the state of North Carolina's anti-seawall regulations. They openly admit that they're concerned that these regulations may reduce the number of projects for them on the shoreline in the future. We must resist the Corps of Engineers' efforts to return us to brute force technology. So far in North Carolina, we have resisted, and our beaches remain a primary attraction to an exploding population of vacationers and year-round residents in search of paradise. But if paradise is not to turn ugly, even threatening, we must try to understand the unique environment in which we have chosen to live and to understand the mounting pressures on us to change what we love. We must understand that on the calmest summer day, the barrier islands are in a constant state of change. We must understand that as sea level rise begins to accelerate in our lifetime, dramatic changes will come to the North Carolina shoreline. We must understand that violent storms are a fact of life on the coast. South Carolina was rocked by Hurricane Hugo last year, but for most of North Carolina, it has been nearly 30 years since the last major storm. The slender, sinuous island necklace that adorns our coast is a unique and magical setting. But we are in danger of loving it to death. Faced with the pressures inherent in the collision between nature's need for change and man's quest for stability, we must resist the temptation to turn these islands into something they are not. To reduce this wonderfully adaptable environment to a rigid fortress against nature, a sterile place that reflects nothing of the natural beauty and the cultural heritage that are the very basis for our love of these islands. There are those who say that we can't afford not to protect their misplaced buildings. And if it were just a matter of dollars, they might have a legitimate point.
But the cost of armoring our shoreline can't always be calculated in dollars. Armoring has hidden costs. Not only the destruction of a natural environment, but it's turning our backs on our cultural heritage. These beaches are so important to our way of life at the coast. Shouldn't we consider beaches to be sacred? Shouldn't we consider unthinkable any action at all that would degrade our beaches? Sure, we can save condominiums at the expense of the beach, but do you want to explain to your grandchildren that you valued a handful of buildings more than their beaches? If you choose to live here, live with the barrier island, not just on the barrier island. When sea level rises, these islands will move, and you can't own part of a moving barrier island. You can only borrow it for a while. Learn about how your island works. Learn how it changed physically over the last years. More important, learn how it changed instantly in the last big storm. Learning about island history will give you a clue to the future, and perhaps it'll even give you pause about living here. Well, here we are back where we started, at the house that's about to fall into the sea. We could protect this house from the sea with hard stabilization, but we in North Carolina have chosen not to because we understand that seawalls destroy beaches. We realize that where the beaches are moving, we must choose between buildings and beaches, and we have chosen beaches. That's why I say that we should be proud of this house. And I see it as our declaration that this generation doesn't have the right to destroy the next generation's beaches. And I think that's beautiful.
Orrin Pilkey's The Beaches Are Moving is now available on video cassette. For information on VHS copies of this program and on the companion book, The Beaches Are Moving, published by Duke University Press, contact Environmental Media, Post Office Box 1016, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 27514, or call Environmental Media at 919-933-3003.